Brian Hampton had faced down Wall Street sharks, hostile board members, and billion-dollar lawsuits without breaking a sweat. But nothing could have prepared him for the moment two college interns walked into the marble lobby of Hampton Dynamics, wearing visitor badges and carrying his eyes. Not similar eyes. His eyes. The same amber brown his grandfather had. The same flecks of gold that caught the light when he was thinking. Eyes he saw every morning in the mirror. They introduced themselves as Joseph and Mary Miller, twin siblings, excited about the summer program. Miller. The name hit him like a freight train. Because 19 years ago, Brian had loved a woman named Barbara Miller, loved her with the kind of reckless certainty only the young possess. And then, terrified by success crashing into his life too soon, he'd walked away. He never knew she was pregnant. Now his past was shaking his hand in the reception area, calling him sir, and asking where the intern orientation would be held. And the worst part? They had absolutely no idea who he really was. If you've ever looked at someone and realized they held the key to a past you thought you'd buried forever, you know this feeling. That moment when everything you built suddenly feels like it was built on sand. Stay with me on this journey because what happens next will remind you that the past doesn't stay buried. It walks through your door when you least expect it. And if stories about second chances and impossible reunions speak to your soul, subscribe now. You belong in this community of people who understand that life doesn't follow the script we wrote. Brian Hampton's mornings followed a rhythm that hadn't changed in 7 years. Black coffee at 6:15 a.m. market, reports by 6:30, 30 minutes in the company gym, shower, charcoal suit, desk by 8 sharp. Control was everything when you ran a tech empire worth $4.7 billion. This particular Tuesday in June started no differently. His assistant, Marjorie, had already placed his schedule on the desk, color-coded, time-blocked, airtight. Morning keynote for the summer intern orientation, lunch with the board, afternoon calls with Tokyo. Predictable, manageable, safe. He straightened his tie and headed toward the glass-walled auditorium on the 3rd floor, where 73 bright-eyed college students waited to hear the founder of Hampton Dynamics tell them how to change the world. Brian had given this speech 24 times. He knew every beat, every pause, every moment to smile. But today, everything shattered in the span of 3 seconds. Because halfway through his opening remarks, he looked up and saw them. A boy and a girl, seated in the 2nd row. Close enough that he could see their faces clearly under the overhead lights. The boy had dark hair, sharp jawline, guarded posture. The girl had softer features, lighter hair pulled into a ponytail, and a curious tilt to her head. But it was their eyes that stopped Brian mid-sentence. Amber brown, deep, flecked with gold near the pupils. His eyes. Brian's throat tightened. He forced himself to continue talking, but his brain had split in two, one half delivering the rehearsed speech about innovation and integrity, the other half screaming a single question on repeat. Who are they? He fumbled a transition. Marjorie glanced up from her tablet, concerned. Brian cleared his throat and pushed forward, but his gaze kept drifting back to the 2nd row. The boy leaned forward when Brian discussed problem-solving strategies, chin tucked, fingers pressed to his temple. It was Brian's exact thinking posture. The same one his college roommate used to tease him about. The girl laughed softly at a self-deprecating joke Brian made. The sound was light, musical, genuine. Just like Barbara used to laugh. Barbara. The name echoed in his chest like a bell he'd tried to bury 19 years ago. When the speech ended and applause filled the auditorium, Brian barely heard it. He descended the stage on autopilot, shaking hands, nodding at comments, his mind racing in 1,000 directions at once. Then the twins approached. The boy extended his hand first. Mr. Hampton, I'm Joseph Miller. This is my sister, Mary. We just wanted to say thank you for that talk. Really inspiring. Miller. The room tilted. Brian forced his face into a smile and shook Joseph's hand. Firm grip, confident, the kind of handshake Brian's grandfather had taught him to give. Joseph, Brian repeated, his voice sounding strange in his own ears. Mary, it's good to meet you both. Mary smiled, warm, open, trusting. We're really excited to be here, Mr. Hampton. Hampton Dynamics has been on our dream internship list since freshman year. Her phrasing, the cadence, the way she emphasized really, Barbara said things that way. Brian's chest constricted. He managed a few more pleasantries, asked them what departments they'd be rotating through, told them to reach out if they needed anything. Professional, detached, the CEO mask firmly in place. But the moment they walked away, Brian's knees nearly buckled. He retreated to his corner office on the 42nd floor, closed the door, and stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Miller. It couldn't be. Barbara Miller had been a chapter of his life he'd closed, locked, buried under years of board meetings and product launches and carefully constructed emotional walls. They'd met in college, Brian, a broke computer science major with more ambition than sense, Barbara, a literature student with a laugh that made him believe impossible things were possible. She'd believed in him when no one else did. Helped him code his first prototype, stayed up with him through all-nighters, loved him in the uncomplicated way people love before the world gets heavy. And then the investor came. The one who saw potential in Brian's half-finished software. The one who demanded every ounce of focus Brian possessed if this was going to work. Brian panicked. He was 22, terrified of failing, convinced that love was a distraction he couldn't afford. So he ended it. Abruptly, cruelly, in hindsight. He told Barbara he needed to focus, that she deserved someone who could give her more. That it wasn't working. She'd looked at him like he'd driven a knife into her chest, and he'd walked away. That was 19 years ago. He never called, never reached out, never looked back. He told himself it was for the best, that she'd moved on, that they both had. But now, two college students with his eyes and her laugh are working in his building. Brian pressed his forehead against the cold glass. The rational part of his brain fought back. Coincidence. Miller is a common name. Lots of people have amber eyes. You're seeing patterns that don't exist. But the other part, the part that recognized Mary's laugh and Joseph's posture and the exact tilt of their heads when they listened, that part knew better. He pulled out his phone and opened the company's intern database. Joseph Miller, age 19, Northwestern University, computer science major, home address, 428 Maple Street, Evanston, Illinois. Mary Miller, age 19, Northwestern University, business administration major, same address. 19 years old. Twins. Brian's hands shook. He opened a private browser window and typed Barbara's name. Nothing recent. Just an old LinkedIn profile from 6 years ago, listing her as a senior accountant at a mid-sized firm in Evanston. No Facebook, no Instagram. She'd always hated social media. Evanston. That's where the twins lived. Brian sat down heavily in his chair, his heart pounding against his ribs. It's impossible, he thought. But what if it isn't? You know that moment when you realize the choices you made 20 years ago are standing right in front of you? When the life you walked away from shows up wearing a name badge and shaking your hand? Some of you watching this have lived that moment. The day your past stopped being past. Drop a comment if you've ever had to face a decision you thought you'd never have to answer for. Because what Brian doesn't know yet is that recognition is just the beginning. The real reckoning is still coming. Brian sat at his desk long after the sun dipped below the Chicago skyline, the city lights blinking on one by one like stars appearing in reverse. His untouched coffee had gone cold hours ago. The spreadsheets on his monitor blurred into meaningless columns of numbers. All he could see were those amber eyes. Joseph and Mary Miller. The names pulled him backward through 19 years like a riptide he couldn't fight. He closed his eyes, and suddenly, he wasn't sitting in a corner office worth more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes. He was 21 years old again, broke and brilliant, and stupidly in love with a girl who believed in him when he could barely afford ramen. Northwestern University, fall semester, junior year. Brian had met Barbara Miller in the most unremarkable way possible, assigned seating in an overbooked introduction to philosophy course neither of them wanted to take. She sat to his left, always 5 minutes early. Always with a thermos of tea that smelled like honey and mint. She took notes in purple ink. She underlined passages in her textbook with a ruler because she couldn't stand crooked lines. Brian noticed her the way anyone notices a person who exists in their peripheral vision 3 times a week. And then, one October afternoon, his laptop died mid-lecture. Barbara slid her notebook across the desk without a word, letting him copy her notes while the professor droned on about Descartes. Her handwriting was neat, precise, impossibly legible. At the bottom of the page, she'd written in the margin, I think, therefore I am hungry. Want to grab lunch after? Brian had looked up, startled. She'd smiled, not flirtatious, just kind, and shrugged. You look like you could use a meal that isn't vending machine pretzels. He'd laughed, and that was it. That was the moment his life split into two categories: before Barbara and after Barbara. They started spending more time together. Study sessions at the library that turned into late-night conversations at the 24-hour diner on Sherman Avenue. Barbara would order pancakes. Brian would steal bites and pretend he wasn't starving because his financial aid hadn't come through yet. She noticed. She always noticed. One night, she showed up at his dorm with 2 bags of groceries. I had extra, she'd said, which was a lie. Barbara was working 2 part-time jobs to cover tuition. She didn't have extra anything, but she gave anyway. That was who she was. By winter break, they were inseparable. By spring semester, they'd moved into a tiny off-campus apartment that smelled like old carpet and had a radiator that clanked like a dying machine. Brian didn't care. It was theirs. He'd set up his workstation in the corner of the living room, a desk he'd found on the curb, 2 mismatched monitors, and a tangle of cables that Barbara threatened to organize every weekend but never did. This was where he built the prototype. The software that would eventually become the foundation of Hampton Dynamics started as a wild idea Brian sketched on napkins during his database management course. A way to streamline supply chain logistics using predictive algorithms. It sounded boring to everyone, except the people who understood how much money boring could make. Barbara didn't understand the code, but she understood him. She sat beside him during all-nighters, keeping him company while he debugged until his eyes burned. She'd quiz him with flashcards for exams he couldn't afford to fail. She'd rub his shoulders when the stress made his back knot up like rope. "You're going to change the world with this, you know," she'd said one night, her voice sleepy and certain. Brian had looked up from his screen, exhausted, doubting everything. "You really think so?" "I know so." And the way she said it like it was fact, not hope, made him believe it too. He kissed her then, tasting honey tea and the kind of love that felt too big for his chest to hold. "I love you, Barbara Miller," he'd whispered against her hair. "I love you too, Brian Hampton, even when you're insufferable." He'd laughed, "Especially when I'm insufferable." Especially then. But love, Brian would learn, doesn't survive panic. The investor came during the spring of their senior year. Martin Schaefer, venture capitalist, steel gray hair, sharper suits, and a handshake that felt like a contract you hadn't read the fine print on. He'd seen Brian's prototype at a university tech expo. 20 minutes later, he'd offered Brian a meeting. A week after that, he'd offered money, real money, the kind that came with expectations and deadlines and pressure that felt like drowning in opportunity. "This could be massive, Hampton," Schaefer had said, leaning back in his leather chair. "But you need to be all in, no distractions, no half measures. You give me 2 years of total focus, and I'll give you the world." Brian had nodded, adrenaline and terror flooding his veins in equal measure. He'd gone home to Barbara that night, buzzing with the news. She'd screamed, hugged him, cried happy tears into his t-shirt. "I knew it," she'd whispered, her voice thick with pride. "I knew you could do this." But over the next few weeks, something shifted. The meetings multiplied, the deadlines tightened. Schaefer's voice grew sharper on phone calls. "Focus, Hampton. Commit. No room for error." Brian stopped sleeping, stopped eating regular meals. His hair grew too long, his eyes hollowed out. And Barbara, sweet and patient and endlessly supportive Barbara, started feeling like a tether he couldn't afford. He'd look at her in the mornings making tea, humming while she got ready for class, and feel a sickening cocktail of love and resentment. "She's a distraction," the panicked voice in his head whispered. "You're going to fail because you can't focus. You're going to lose everything." He tried to talk himself out of it, tried to logic his way through the fear. But fear doesn't care about logic. So one May evening, 3 weeks before graduation, Brian did the unforgivable thing. He ended it. Barbara had been washing dishes, talking about summer plans, about maybe taking a weekend trip to Michigan before they both started working full-time. "Barbara," Brian interrupted, his voice flat and unfamiliar. "We need to talk." She'd turned, confused, hands still wet. "I don't think this is working anymore." Silence. The kind of silence that has weight, that breaks things. What? Her voice was so small. I need to focus on the company. Schaefer's investing serious money, and I can't be distracted right now. Distracted? She'd repeated the word like it was in a foreign language. Brian. I've been supporting you. I know, and I'm grateful. But I need space. I need to do this on my own. Lies, all lies. He didn't need space. He needed her. But the terror of failing was louder than the truth. Barbara stared at him, tears pooling in her eyes but not falling. You're serious? I'm sorry. Don't. Her voice cracked. Don't apologize like this is something that just happened. You're making a choice. Barbara, get out. This is my apartment too. Then I'll leave. She grabbed her jacket, her keys, her purse. Her hands were shaking so badly, she dropped the keys twice. Brian stood there, frozen, screaming at himself to take it back, to tell her the truth, to say he was terrified and stupid and desperately in love with her. But he didn't. He let her walk out, and he never called her back. What Brian didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Barbara had woken up that same morning feeling nauseous. She'd bought a pregnancy test on her way home from class, 2 pink lines. She was going to tell him that night, after dinner, with joy and terror and hope that they'd figure it out together. Instead, she sat on the bathroom floor of her best friend's apartment, staring at those 2 pink lines, and made a decision. She wasn't going to beg Brian Hampton to love her. She wasn't going to force him to be a father when he'd made it clear his company mattered more. She would raise the twins herself, alone, with dignity. She never called, never told him. She simply disappeared from his life the same way he'd erased her from his. Brian opened his eyes. The office was dark now, except for the glow of his monitors. His chest ached with a grief 19 years old, and sharp as fresh glass. He'd built an empire, changed industries, made billions. But he'd lost everything that mattered. And now, the children he never knew existed were 3 floors below him, laughing with other interns, completely unaware that the man in the corner office was the father who'd abandoned them before they were born. What kind of man does that make me? Brian thought. He didn't have an answer, but he knew, with terrifying certainty, that the truth would come out. And when it did, there would be no algorithm to fix it, no investor to save him, no amount of money to undo what he'd broken. Just 2 19-year-olds with his eyes and her heart, asking the question he couldn't answer. Why weren't we enough? Have you ever made a decision that seemed right in the moment, but haunted you for decades? Some of you know exactly what Brian's feeling right now, that crushing weight of realizing you sacrificed the wrong things for success. If you've ever chosen your career over love, or ambition over family, and wondered if you could ever get it back, you're not alone here. Hit that like button if this story is already hitting too close to home. Because what's coming next will show you that some mistakes can't be undone, they can only be faced. The Hampton Dynamics internship program followed a rigid rotation schedule. 2 weeks in operations, 2 weeks in product development, 2 weeks in strategic planning. The goal was exposure, giving young talent a panoramic view of how a billion-dollar company functioned from multiple angles. Brian had designed the program himself 5 years ago. He'd never imagined it would become his personal torture chamber. Joseph Miller was assigned to the product development team first. Mary went to strategic planning. Brian told himself he wouldn't seek them out, wouldn't watch them, wouldn't confirm or deny the impossible question burning a hole through his chest. He lasted exactly 48 hours. On Wednesday afternoon, Brian found himself standing outside the glass-walled conference room, where the product development team held their weekly innovation pitch session. He'd told Marjorie he wanted to observe the intern integration process firsthand. She'd given him a look that said she knew he was lying but would allow it anyway. Through the glass, Brian watched Joseph stand at the front of the room, presenting a modification to one of Hampton's legacy algorithms. The kid, his son, maybe his son, held a marker in his left hand, tapping it against his palm while he talked. Brian's throat tightened. He did that, the marker tapping. It was a nervous habit his college professors used to tease him about during oral presentations. Joseph's presentation style was confident but not arrogant. He acknowledged potential flaws in his approach before anyone could point them out. He asked clarifying questions that were sharper than half the senior developers in the room. And when someone challenged his logic, Joseph paused, chin tucked slightly, fingers pressed to his temple, eyes distant, working through the problem in real time. It was like watching a recording of himself at 20. Brian's pulse hammered in his ears. One of the senior developers, Marcus Webb, leaned forward. "That's solid thinking, Miller. Where'd you learn to approach problems like that?" Joseph shrugged, almost sheepish. "My mom, actually. She's an accountant. She taught me and my sister to work backward from the solution when we got stuck on math homework." Barbara was studying accounting, Brian remembered with a jolt. She switched majors senior year because she needed something practical, something that would pay the bills after graduation. After he'd left her, Marcus laughed. "Smart woman. You should bring her by sometime. We could use that kind of logic consulting for us." Joseph smiled, polite, warm, but guarded. "Yeah, maybe." Brian turned away before anyone noticed him watching. His hands were shaking. Thursday morning, Brian sat in on a strategic planning brainstorming session. He told himself it was routine executive oversight. It wasn't. Mary Miller sat 3 seats down from him at the long mahogany table, taking notes on a laptop while the team discussed market expansion strategies. She typed, fast fingers flying across the keys, in a rhythm that was almost musical. Every few minutes, she'd pause to tuck a strand of hair behind her left ear. Barbara used to do that, exactly that, the same unconscious gesture when she was concentrating. Then Mary spoke up, her voice clear and thoughtful. "I think we're approaching this backward. Instead of asking what markets can we enter, maybe we should ask what problems exist in markets we're ignoring. That shifts the focus from us to them." The room went quiet. Jennifer Okafor, Hampton's chief strategy officer, raised an eyebrow. "Elaborate." "Well," Mary continued, gaining confidence, "if we lead with problems instead of products, we're more likely to build solutions people actually need rather than solutions we think they need. It's more empathetic, more human." Jennifer nodded slowly, impressed. "That's a really insightful reframe." "Mary, where'd that come from?" Mary smiled, and it was Barbara's smile, soft and a little self-deprecating. "Honestly, my mom always says, people don't care what you know until they know that you care. I guess I just applied it to business strategy." Brian's chest constricted so violently he thought he might be having a heart attack. Barbara used to say that, all the time. It was one of her core philosophies, something she'd learned from her grandmother. Jennifer jotted down notes. "I like that. Let's explore it further." Mary beamed, clearly pleased. And Brian had to excuse himself from the meeting early, mumbling something about an urgent call, because he couldn't breathe properly in that room anymore. By Friday, Brian had abandoned all pretense of normality. He pulled the twins' employment files from HR, flagging them as CEO review for program assessment, so no one would question it. Joseph Allen Miller, born the 14th of November, 2006. Current address, 428 Maple Street, Evanston, Illinois. Emergency contact, Barbara J. Miller, mother. Mary Elizabeth Miller, born the 14th of November, 2006. Same address, same emergency contact. The 14th of November, 2006. Brian did the math in his head for the 100th time. He'd ended things with Barbara in May 2006. 9 months later, February 2007. If Barbara had been pregnant when he left, no. The twins were born in November 2006. That meant Barbara would have been pregnant in February or March of that year, which meant they'd still been together. Brian's vision blurred. She'd been pregnant, while they were still happy, while she was still bringing him groceries and quizzing him with flashcards and believing in him. And he'd walked away from her 2 months before she would have started showing. The implications gutted him. He pulled up the employee portal and found the twins' academic records, listed as part of their application materials. Both had attended Evanston Township High School. Both had strong GPAs. Joseph had won a regional coding competition. Mary had been editor of the school newspaper. Under parent, guardian information, Barbara's name appeared alone. Father, not listed. Brian stared at those 2 words until they burned into his retinas. Not listed. Because he hadn't been there. Hadn't known, hadn't been given the chance to be listed. Or maybe, and this thought was worse, because Barbara had decided he didn't deserve to be. That night, Brian stayed late at the office, long after everyone else had gone home. The city stretched out below him, Millions of lights representing millions of lives he'd never touch, never know, never impact. He'd built an empire. But he'd missed 19 years of his children's lives. If they're even mine, he reminded himself weakly. You don't have proof, just coincidences, just familiar mannerisms and a last name. But deep down, beneath the denial and the fear, he knew. He'd known the moment he saw their eyes. Brian opened the bottom drawer of his desk, the one he never opened, the one filled with things he should have thrown away years ago, but couldn't. Underneath old business cards and a broken watch, he found it. A photograph, creased and faded, taken on a disposable camera at some college party neither of them had wanted to attend. Barbara Miller, age 21, smiling at the camera with her head tilted against Brian's shoulder, her eyes bright, her laugh frozen mid-sound. Brian held the photo with trembling hands. He looked at Barbara's face. Then he pictured Mary's smile. Joseph's eyes. The resemblance wasn't subtle, it was undeniable. What if these two brilliant interns are mine? He whispered to the empty office. The question hung in the air like smoke, heavy and suffocating. And for the first time in 19 years, Brian Hampton, the man who'd built an empire on calculated risks and data-driven decisions, had absolutely no idea what to do next. Because there was no algorithm for this. No spreadsheet that could quantify the weight of 2 decades of absence. No investor pitch that could make up for missing first words. First steps. First heartbreaks. Just 2 19-year-olds working 3 floors below him who had his grandfather's eyes and their mother's heart, and a truth that was about to detonate everything. You're watching a man realize that success isn't measured in stock prices or corner offices. It's measured in the moments you showed up for the people who needed you. How many of you built something incredible but lost someone irreplaceable along the way? This story is for every woman who sacrificed love for a dream and wondered if it was worth it. Subscribe if you're ready for stories that don't shy away from the hard truths about the choices we make. Because Brian's about to discover that the past doesn't just knock politely, sometimes it breaks down the door. Monday arrived with the kind of weather that felt like a cosmic joke. Bright, cloudless, aggressively cheerful. Brian sat at his desk, reviewing quarterly projections, forcing himself into the familiar rhythm of spreadsheets and forecasts. If he could just focus on numbers, on predictable data, maybe he could silence the chaos in his head. Maybe he could stop seeing Joseph's thinking posture in every quiet moment. Maybe he could stop hearing Barbara's inflections in Mary's voice. His phone buzzed. Email notification. From Mary Miller. Subject: Strategic Planning Draft, Market Expansion Analysis. Attachment: SP, Draft Report, November 2025. PDF. Brian opened it without thinking. Standard intern work. Mary had been tasked with compiling research on emerging markets in Southeast Asia. Entry-level analysis. Nothing complex. He skimmed the PDF. Clean formatting. Solid research. The kind of thorough work that would have earned Barbara an A in any business class. Then he scrolled to the second page and froze. There was another document embedded in the file. A scan, slightly blurry, as if photographed quickly with a phone camera. Medical information letterhead across the top. Evanston Hospital, Birth Records Department. Brian's pulse spiked. She didn't mean to attach this, his brain registered distantly. She was probably scanning documents for something else. She didn't know. But his eyes were already reading. Certificate of live birth. Twin registration. Mother Barbara Jean Miller. Date of birth. Mother the 3rd of April 1985. Father unknown. Child A, twin A. Name, Joseph Allen Miller. Date of birth, the 14th of November 2006. Time of birth, 11:47 p.m. Weight, 6 pounds, 3 ounces. Child B, twin B. Name, Mary Elizabeth Miller. Date of birth, the 14th of November 2006. Time of birth, 11:52 p.m. Weight, 5 pounds 9 ounces. The document blurred. Brian's hands started shaking so violently, he dropped his phone. Father. Unknown. 2 words. 10 letters. They detonated his entire world. The 14th of November 2006. He'd left Barbara in May 2006. She would have been 3 months pregnant, maybe 4. She knew. She knew when he walked out, when he told her she was a distraction, when he chose his company over her. And she never said a word. Brian couldn't breathe. His chest felt like it was caving in, ribs compressing around lungs that wouldn't expand. Joseph Allen Miller. Mary Elizabeth Miller. His children? His children. Not a possibility. Not a theory. Fact. The room tilted. Brian gripped the edge of his desk, knuckles white, trying to anchor himself to something solid, while his entire reality rewrote itself in real time. 19 years. First steps he never saw. First words he never heard. First days of school, scraped knees, birthday parties, high school graduations, an entire lifetime of moments he'd been absent from because he was too terrified and stupid to stay. A sound escaped his throat, something between a sob and a gasp. Father. Unknown. Not father. Brian Hampton. Not father. Absent by choice. Just unknown. As if he'd never existed at all. And maybe, Brian thought with crushing clarity, to Joseph and Mary, he hadn't. He was just the billionaire CEO they called Mr. Hampton during presentations. A stranger in a charcoal suit who signed their internship paychecks. Nothing more. His phone buzzed again. A follow-up email from Mary. Mr. Hampton, I am so sorry, I just realized I accidentally attached a personal document to that file. Please disregard the second page. I'll resend a clean version immediately. Again, my apologies for the unprofessionalism. Best, Mary Miller. Brian stared at the message. She was panicking, embarrassed, probably terrified she'd just sabotaged her internship by sending private medical records to the CEO. She had no idea she'd just confirmed what he'd suspected for 2 weeks. She had no idea the man reading her apology email was her father. Brian stood abruptly, his chair rolling backward and slamming into the credenza. Marjorie's voice crackled through the intercom. Mr. Hampton? Your 2 p.m. with the board is in 10 minutes. Should I? Cancel it, Brian interrupted, his voice hoarse and unfamiliar. Silence. Then, cautiously, cancel the board meeting. Cancel everything. Today. This week. I don't care. Tell them. Tell them it's a family emergency. Because it was. It was the biggest emergency of his life. Mr. Hampton, are you? Brian grabbed his keys and walked out without answering. The drive to Evanston took 40 minutes in midday traffic that felt like hours. Brian's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his fingers went numb. His mind oscillated between fury and grief. Between rage at Barbara for hiding this, and rage at himself for giving her reasons to. She should have told me, one voice screamed. You didn't deserve to know, another whispered back. Both were true. Both were unbearable. 428 Maple Street materialized in front of him. A small, well-maintained 2-story house with blue shutters, and a garden that looked lovingly tended. A tire swing hung from an old oak tree in the front yard. Joseph and Mary grew up here, Brian realized. This is where they learned to walk, to read, to become the people they are. And he'd never seen it before today. He sat in his car for 5 full minutes. Engine off, heart hammering. What am I going to say? Hello, Barbara. I found out we have children. Surprise? Why didn't you tell me? I'm sorry. Every option felt inadequate, pathetic. But staying in the car felt worse. Brian forced himself out and walked up the stone pathway to the front door. His legs felt disconnected from his body, moving on autopilot, while his brain screamed at him to run. He raised his hand. Knocked. 3 sharp raps that sounded too loud, too final. Footsteps inside, muffled, getting closer. The door opened, and there she was. Barbara Miller. 19 years older, hair shorter, streaked with gray she hadn't tried to hide. Laugh lines around her eyes, exhaustion etched into her face in ways that hadn't been there in college. But her eyes, those eyes, were the same. And the moment she saw him, they widened with pure, undiluted shock. Brian? His name on her lips after 19 years of silence hit him like a physical blow. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Barbara's expression shifted from shock to something harder, defensive. Her hand tightened on the doorframe. What are you doing here? 3 words. Quiet, controlled. But underneath, Brian heard everything she wasn't saying. How dare you? You have no right. After 19 years, you show up now? Brian finally found his voice, though it came out broken. Desperate. Barbara, he whispered. Why didn't you tell me? Her face didn't change. But her eyes filled with something that looked like old grief mixed with fresh rage. And in that moment, standing on her doorstep trembling, Brian understood. The reckoning he'd avoided for 19 years had finally arrived, and there was nowhere left to run. Ladies, have you ever had to face someone from your past and explain why you made the choices you did? Barbara's standing at that door, carrying 19 years of single motherhood on her shoulders. She raised 2 children alone, while the man who left her became a billionaire. If you've ever had to be mother and father because someone else chose not to show up, you understand what's about to happen. Comment below if you know what it feels like to carry that kind of weight alone, because this confrontation, it's been 19 years in the making, and it's going to be brutal. They stood frozen on opposite sides of the threshold, Brian on the weathered welcome mat, Barbara gripping the doorframe like it was the only thing keeping her upright. 19 years collapsed into a single moment. Brian saw it all in her face, the shock, the recognition, the way her expression hardened from surprise into something that looked like armor being strapped back on after years of peace. This wasn't the soft-eyed girl who'd brought him groceries and believed in his dreams. This was a woman forged in the fire of single motherhood, a woman who'd survived 2 decades without him and learned to stop needing him. "Brian," she repeated, her voice steadier now, colder. "I asked you a question. What are you doing here?" He struggled to form words. Barbara, I saw." "You saw what?" Her knuckles went white against the wood. "The birth certificate. Mary accidentally attached it to a work file and Barbara's face drained of color. "Mary? They're working for me," Brian said, the words tumbling out now, desperate and clumsy. "Joseph and Mary. They're interns at Hampton Dynamics. I didn't know who they were at first, but then I saw their eyes, and the way they—" "Stop." Barbara held up her hand, trembling. "Stop talking." She stepped back from the door, and for a horrible moment, Brian thought she was going to slam it in his face. Instead, she turned and walked into the house, leaving the door open behind her. An invitation, or maybe just an acknowledgement that this conversation was inevitable. Brian followed her inside. The living room was modest, but warm. Photographs lined the mantel. Joseph and Mary, at every stage of life Brian had missed. Toothless grins, Little League uniforms, prom dresses and rented tuxedos, high school graduation caps frozen mid-toss, an entire life documented in frames. A life he hadn't been part of. Barbara stood with her back to him, arms crossed tightly across her chest, defensive, protective. When she finally turned around, her eyes were wet but her jaw was set. "You have some nerve," she said quietly. "Showing up here after 19 years. After you walked away like I was nothing." "Barbara." "No," her voice cracked. "You don't get to Barbara me. You don't get to show up on my doorstep and act wounded because I didn't tell you about my children." "Our children," Brian corrected, his own voice breaking. "Mine," Barbara shot back, fierce and certain. "I raised them. I fed them. I sat up with them through fevers and nightmares. I taught them to read and helped them with homework and held them when they cried about things I couldn't fix." "Where were you, Brian? Where were you when Joseph broke his arm falling off his bike? Where were you when Mary had her heart broken for the first time?" Each question was a knife. Brian had no defense, no answer. "I didn't know," he whispered. "If I'd known." "You'd have what?" Barbara laughed bitterly. "Come running back? You made your choice, Brian. You told me I was a distraction. You chose Hampton Dynamics over me." "I was terrified," Brian said desperately. "I was 22 and drowning, and I didn't know how to." "So was I," Barbara shouted, and the sound filled the small room like thunder. "I was 22 and pregnant, and alone, because you decided your fear mattered more than everything we'd built together." Tears spilled down her cheeks now, unchecked. "You didn't even call, Brian, not once, not to check if I was okay, not to apologize, not to explain. You just disappeared. Like the 2 years we spent together meant nothing to you." "That's not true," Brian's voice shattered. "Barbara, you meant everything to me. You still don't." She wiped her face roughly. "Don't you dare stand in my house and tell me I meant something to you when you spent 19 years proving otherwise." Silence crashed between them like a physical force. Brian felt his composure crumbling completely. Why didn't you tell me? His voice came out raw, pleading. When you found out you were pregnant, why didn't you tell you? Barbara's laugh was sharp and humorless. Tell the man who just dumped me because I was a distraction that I was carrying his twins? What did you think would happen, Brian? That you'd suddenly change your mind? That you'd choose us over your billion-dollar dreams? She shook her head, anger giving way to old grief. I wasn't going to beg you to love me. I wasn't going to trap you with a pregnancy you didn't want. So, I made a choice. I decided to protect my children from a father who'd already proven he didn't want to stay. The words hit Brian like a physical blow. I would have stayed, he whispered, if I'd known. Out of obligation? Barbara's voice went quiet, deadly. You think that's what I wanted for Joseph and Mary? A father who stayed because he had to? Who resented them for derailing his empire? I wouldn't have. You don't know that, Barbara shouted. You don't get to rewrite history and pretend you would have been some noble, devoted father when you couldn't even handle being a boyfriend. Brian's knees nearly buckled. He sank onto the arm of the couch, hands covering his face. They work for you, Barbara said after a long moment, her voice hollow now, exhausted. You said they work for you. Brian nodded, unable to speak. Do they know? No. The word came out strangled. They have no idea. Barbara closed her eyes. This is my worst nightmare. Barbara, I kept them away from you on purpose, she continued, her voice shaking. I built a life where they were safe and loved and whole without needing a father who didn't want them. And now you're telling me they walked straight into your world anyway? I didn't plan this, Brian said desperately. I didn't know they'd applied for the internship. I didn't recognize their names until... They don't need you disrupting everything, Barbara interrupted, and there was steel in her voice now. They have lives, Brian. Good lives. Joseph is brilliant, top of his class, full scholarship. Mary's the same. They're happy, adjusted. They don't sit around pining for a father they never met. Don't I have a right? A right? Barbara's eyes flashed. You forfeited your rights 19 years ago when you walked out that door. That's not fair. Fair? Barbara's laugh was bitter. You want to talk about fair? I raised twins alone while you built an empire. I worked 2 jobs while going to night school so I could give them a better life. I missed sleep and meals, and any semblance of a social life, so they'd never feel the absence of a father. Don't talk to me about fair, Brian. The truth of it crushed him. She was right. She'd done everything, sacrificed everything. And he'd done nothing but succeed in the exact ways he'd been too terrified to fail. What do you want from me? Barbara asked finally, her voice cracking with exhaustion. Why are you really here? Brian looked up at her, this woman he'd loved and abandoned, this mother who'd raised his children alone, this stranger he'd once known better than anyone. I want to be their father, he whispered. Barbara's face crumpled. You can't just decide that now, she said, tears streaming again. You can't walk in here 19 years late and demand a place in their lives. I'm not demanding, I'm asking. Barbara, please. They're adults now, Barbara said firmly. They get to decide if. Honest, continuation of complete script. They want you in their lives. Not you, not me, them. Brian nodded slowly. Then, I need to tell them the truth. No. Barbara's voice went sharp with panic. Brian, no. Not yet. Not like this. They're in the middle of their internship, they're focused on school and careers, and they deserve to know who I am, Brian said quietly. They deserve the choice. Barbara stared at him, something breaking behind her eyes. If you do this, she whispered, if you tell them, and then disappear again when it gets hard, I will never forgive you, and neither will they. Brian stood, his legs unsteady but his resolve hardening. I'm not going anywhere, he said. Not this time. Barbara searched his face for a long moment, looking for the lie, the escape route, the same fear that had driven him away 19 years ago. But Brian met her gaze without flinching. Finally, Barbara exhaled a long, shuddering breath that sounded like surrender. Then God help us all, she whispered. Brian walked back to his car in a daze, the late afternoon sun too bright against the devastation inside his chest. He'd spent 19 years building something unshakable. But in 20 minutes, Barbara Miller had dismantled every defense he'd constructed, every justification he'd clung to, every lie he'd told himself about why he'd walked away. He sat in the driver's seat, hands shaking, and realized the hardest conversation hadn't even happened yet. He still had to tell Joseph and Mary the truth. He still had to look into those amber eyes and say the words that would change everything. I'm your father, and I'm sorry. How many of you have carried a secret so heavy it changed the shape of your life? Barbara spent 19 years protecting her children from a father who didn't choose them. Some secrets we keep to protect the people we love. Some secrets we keep because the truth feels too dangerous to speak out loud. If this story is reaching into places in your heart you thought you'd locked away, you're exactly where you need to be. Share this with someone who understands what it means to carry the weight of silence. Because what happens next is going to break everything wide open. Brian didn't sleep that night. He sat in his apartment overlooking Lake Michigan, watching the city lights blur into dawn, trying to figure out how to tell Joseph and Mary the truth without destroying them. Every script he rehearsed in his head sounded wrong, inadequate, like trying to explain an earthquake with a weather report. By the time his alarm went off at 6 a.m., he'd abandoned all pretense of a plan and simply resolved to tell them today, before he lost his nerve. But Mary found him first. The knock on his office door came at 8:47 a.m., sharp, hesitant, the sound of someone who'd been standing outside for 10 minutes gathering courage. "Come in," Brian called, his voice rough from lack of sleep. The door opened. Mary Miller stepped inside, and Brian's heart stopped. She looked smaller than usual, younger. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, like she'd been crying or trying not to. She clutched her phone in both hands like a lifeline. "Mr. Hampton," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you have a minute?" Brian stood immediately, alarm flooding his chest. "Mary, of course, sit down. Are you okay?" She didn't sit. Instead, she closed the door behind her and stood there, trembling, staring at him with an expression that made Brian's stomach drop. Recognition, confusion, grief. Oh God, Brian thought. She knows. "I need to ask you something," Mary said, her voice shaking. "And I need you to be honest with me." Brian's mouth went dry. "Okay." Mary took a breath, the kind people take before jumping off a cliff. "Last night I went home to grab something from my mom's room," she began, words tumbling out in a rush, "and I saw a picture on her nightstand, an old one, college-aged, a guy with his arm around her, both of them laughing." She looked up at Brian, eyes glistening. "It was you." The world tilted. Brian opened his mouth, but nothing came out. "I confronted her," Mary continued, her voice cracking. "I asked her who you were, why she had your picture after all these years. She tried to brush it off, said it was just an old friend from college, that it didn't matter anymore. But she wouldn't look at me when she said it. And my mom. My mom doesn't lie to me." Tears spilled down Mary's cheeks now. "So I looked you up, Brian Hampton, Northwestern, class of 2006, same year as my mom, computer science major, started Hampton Dynamics the year I was born." She took a step closer, and Brian saw the exact moment her composure shattered. "Mr. Hampton," she whispered, her voice breaking completely. "Why do I look so much like you?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Brian felt something inside him crack open, all the defenses he'd built, all the carefully constructed walls, crumbling in the face of this 19-year-old girl asking the question he'd been dreading for 2 weeks. He couldn't lie to her. He couldn't do to her what he'd done to Barbara. "Mary," Brian said, his voice wrecked. "Sit down, please." This time she did, sinking into the chair across from his desk like her legs couldn't hold her anymore. Brian sat too, his hands shaking so badly he had to press them flat against the desk. "Your mother and I," he began, then stopped, started again. "We were together in college, for 2 years. I loved her, more than I'd ever loved anyone." Mary's breath hitched. "When I got my first real investor," Brian continued, forcing himself to meet her eyes, "I panicked. I was 22 and terrified and convinced I was going to fail. So I ended things with your mother. Abruptly. Cruelly. I told her I needed to focus on my company." His voice cracked. "I didn't know she was pregnant." Mary's hand flew to her mouth. "She never told me," Brian whispered, "and I never called to check on her, never reached out. I walked away, and I didn't look back, and I have spent 19 years building an empire on the foundation of the worst mistake I ever made." Tears were streaming down Mary's face now, silent and devastating. I didn't know you existed, Brian said, his own vision blurring. I didn't know about Joseph, not until you walked into the intern orientation, and I saw your eyes, my grandfather's eyes, and I started to suspect. And then you accidentally sent me that birth certificate and He couldn't finish. Mary stared at him, her face a mixture of shock and grief, and something that looked like heartbreak. You're my father, she said flatly. Not a question, a fact being absorbed in real time. Yes. The word felt like a confession, and an apology, and an inadequate explanation, all at once. Mary closed her eyes, fresh tears sliding down her cheeks. Her hands were shaking in her lap. Did you ever love us? She whispered. I didn't know. Did you ever think about my mom? Mary's voice rose, raw with pain. Did you ever wonder if she was okay? If ending things with her might have consequences you couldn't see? Brian felt each question like a physical blow. I thought about her every day, he said honestly. But I was a coward. I was terrified that if I reached out, I'd realize I'd made the wrong choice, that I'd thrown away something irreplaceable for something that might fail. So you just left her alone. I didn't know. You didn't ask, Mary shouted, and the sound filled the office like thunder. You didn't care enough to ask if she was okay. You just decided your fear mattered more than she did. The same words Barbara had used. The same wound, reopened. Brian had no defense. You're right, he whispered. You're absolutely right. Mary wiped her face roughly, trying to compose herself, and failing. My mom raised us alone, she said, her voice shaking with rage and grief. She worked 2 jobs. She went to night school. She missed sleep and meals, so we could have everything we needed. She was there for every scraped knee, every school play, every moment that mattered. She looked up at Brian with red, swollen eyes. And you were here, building this. She gestured around the office, the floor-to-ceiling windows, the expensive art, the view that cost more than most people's homes. You built an empire while she built a family. Brian felt the truth of it crush him. I know, he said, his voice barely audible. And I'm sorry, Mary. I'm so. Don't. Mary held up her hand, trembling. Don't apologize like it fixes anything. Silence crashed between them. Then Mary asked the question that broke him completely. Why weren't we enough to stay for? Her voice was small, childlike. The voice of every kid who'd ever wondered why a parent left. And Brian shattered. You would have been. He choked out, tears spilling down his face now. If I'd known about you, if I'd stayed, you would have been everything. But I was 22 and stupid and terrified, and I made a choice that destroyed the best thing I ever had. Mary stared at him, this man who was her father, this stranger who shared her eyes, this billionaire who'd missed her entire life. I don't know what to do with this, she whispered. I don't either, Brian admitted. More silence, heavy, suffocating. Then Mary stood, her movements slow and mechanical, like she was moving through water. I need to go, she said quietly. Mary, I need to process this. I need to. I can't be here right now. She walked toward the door, each step deliberate. Brian stood, desperate. Mary, please. Can we? She turned back, and the look on her face stopped him mid-sentence. It wasn't anger. It was grief. Pure, devastating grief for the father she'd never had, and the family that had been stolen from her before she was even born. I had a good childhood, Mary said softly. My mom made sure of that. Joseph and I never felt like we were missing anything because she loved us enough for 2 parents. Her voice cracked. But now I know we were missing something, and I don't know how to forgive you for that. I don't know if I ever can. She opened the door. Mary, Brian whispered, his voice breaking. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. She paused in the doorway, her back to him. So am I, she said quietly. And then she walked out. The door closed with a soft click that sounded like an ending. Brian stood alone in his office, surrounded by everything he'd built, everything he'd achieved, everything he'd sacrificed his family for. And for the first time in 19 years, he understood exactly what he'd lost. Everything that mattered. Ladies, that question Mary just asked, why weren't we enough to stay for? That's the question every abandoned child carries in their heart, isn't it? Whether your father left, or your husband walked out, or someone chose their dreams over your family, that question doesn't have an age limit. 65-year-old women are still asking it about fathers who left when they were 5. If you felt that question in your bones, leave a heart emoji in the comments, because you're not alone in carrying that weight. And what's about to happen next will show you that sometimes the hardest truth is the one we have to speak to our own children. Brian didn't have time to collect himself before the storm hit. 2 hours after Mary walked out, his office door slammed open so hard it ricocheted off the wall. Joseph Miller stood in the doorway, chest heaving, fists clenched at his sides, eyes blazing with a rage so pure it seemed to electrify the air around him. Marjorie appeared behind him, flustered. "Mr. Hampton, I'm so sorry. He just—" "Get out," Joseph said, his voice low and dangerous. Not to Brian, to Marjorie. "Joseph," Brian started. "I said get out?" Joseph repeated, louder now, still staring at Brian with an intensity that could cut steel. Marjorie looked at Brian, uncertain. Brian nodded once. "It's okay, Marjorie. Close the door, please." She retreated quickly, pulling the door shut behind her. The silence that followed was suffocating. Joseph stood there, trembling with barely contained fury, his jaw working like he was physically biting back words, too venomous to release all at once. Brian had faced down hostile investors, cutthroat competitors, boardroom coups. None of it compared to standing in front of his son, this young man he didn't know, this stranger who shared his blood and waiting for the verdict he knew he deserved. "Mary told me," Joseph finally said, his voice shaking. "Everything." Brian's throat tightened. "Joseph, don't." Joseph held up his hand, and Brian saw it was trembling. "Don't say my name like you have the right to. You don't get to do that." The words landed like physical blows. "You left her," Joseph continued, his voice rising. "You left my mother, pregnant, with twins, and you never looked back." "I didn't know." "You didn't ask," Joseph shouted, and the sound exploded through the office. "You didn't care enough to check. You just decided your company mattered more than the woman who loved you, and you walked away." Brian felt tears burning behind his eyes, but forced them back. Joseph didn't need to see him cry. Joseph needed to rage. "You're right," Brian said quietly. Joseph blinked, thrown by the admission. "I didn't ask," Brian continued, his voice steady despite the devastation tearing through his chest. "I was a coward. I was terrified of failing, and instead of talking to Barbara, instead of letting her help me through it, I convinced myself she was the problem. That loving her would destroy my chances of success." He took a shaky breath. "I was wrong. About everything." Joseph's eyes narrowed. "You think admitting it makes it better?" "No," Brian said honestly. "Nothing makes it better." Joseph took a step forward, his hands clenched so tightly, his knuckles had gone white. "Do you have any idea what my mom went through?" His voice cracked. "She was 22 years old, pregnant with twins, and completely alone because you decided she wasn't worth staying for." "Joseph." "She worked 2 jobs." Joseph's voice broke completely now, grief mixing with rage. "She went to school at night. She missed sleep. She missed meals. She sacrificed everything so Mary and I would never feel like we were missing a father." Tears were streaming down Joseph's face now, unchecked. "But we did miss you," he choked out. "We just didn't know it. We didn't know there was this hole in our family where you were supposed to be. And now I find out you were here the whole time, building this empire, getting rich, living your best life, while my mom was raising us alone." Each word was a knife. Brian had no defense, no justification, just the crushing weight of 19 years of absence. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Joseph, I'm so sorry." "Sorry?" Joseph laughed bitterly. "You're sorry? You missed everything. First words, first steps, first days of school. You missed Mary breaking her wrist in 4th grade. You missed me getting bullied in middle school. You missed Mom crying in the kitchen when she thought we couldn't hear because she was so tired and so alone." His voice rose again, breaking. "You missed us, and you don't get to just say sorry and make that okay." "I know," Brian said, his own voice cracking. "I know I can't make it okay. I know I missed everything that mattered. But Joseph, if I could go back—" "But you can't," Joseph shouted. "You can't go back. You can't undo 19 years. You can't suddenly decide you want to be a father now that we're adults and don't need you anymore." The truth of it shattered Brian completely. "You're right," he said, tears finally spilling down his face. "You don't need me. You never did. Your mother made sure of that. She did an extraordinary job raising you without me. You and Mary are brilliant and kind and strong, and none of that has anything to do with me." Joseph's breathing was ragged, his face flushed with emotion. "Then why are you here?" he demanded. "Why tell us now? Why disrupt everything?" "Because you deserve to know the truth," Brian said, "and because I'm tired of being a coward." Joseph stared at him, chest heaving, tears streaming. "What do you want from us?" His voice was quieter now, exhausted. "Forgiveness? A relationship? A chance to play dad 19 years too late?" Brian wiped his face roughly. "I don't expect forgiveness. I haven't earned it, and I don't have the right to ask for a relationship." "Then what?" "Let me earn whatever place you allow me," Brian said, his voice breaking on every word. "If that's nothing, I'll accept it. If that's just existing on the periphery of your lives, knowing you're okay, I'll accept that too. But if you give me even the smallest chance to prove I'm not the same terrified 22-year-old who walked away from your mother, I promise I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve it." Joseph's face crumpled. He turned away, pressing his palms against his eyes. "I don't know if I can do that," he whispered. "I don't know if I can let you in after knowing you chose not to be there." "I understand," Brian said. "My mom deserved better than you," Joseph said, turning back, his voice fierce with protective love. "She deserved someone who would stay, who would fight for her, who would choose her, even when things got hard." "She did," Brian agreed. "She deserved all of that and more." Joseph's face twisted with fresh pain. "And Mary and I, we deserved a father who wanted us." The words hung in the air like an indictment. "You did," Brian whispered. "And I'm sorry I wasn't that man. I'm sorry I let fear make my choices. I'm sorry I missed your entire childhood. I'm sorry for all of it." Joseph stood there, trembling, caught between rage and grief, and something that looked like desperate longing for a father he'd never had. "I hate you," he said. But his voice cracked on the words. "I know. I hate that you exist. I hate that you look like me. I hate that I spent my whole life wondering what my father was like, and now I know he's just you, someone who left." Brian nodded, accepting every blow. "But I also," Joseph's voice broke completely, "I also wish you'd stayed." The admission seemed to cost him everything. Brian took a half-step forward, instinct screaming at him to hug his son, to close the gap, to offer comfort. But Joseph stepped back, shaking his head. "I can't," he whispered. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. I need time." "Take all the time you need," Brian said. Joseph moved toward the door, his movement slow, exhausted, like the rage had burned through him and left only ash. He paused with his hand on the doorknob. "If you hurt my mom again," he said quietly, not looking back. "If you hurt Mary. If you disappear when this gets hard. I will never forgive you. And I will make sure you regret it." "I won't," Brian promised. "I'm not going anywhere." Joseph's hand tightened on the doorknob. For a long moment, he stood there, frozen. Then he spoke again, so quietly Brian almost didn't hear it. "I used to dream about meeting my father. When I was little, I'd imagine him showing up and explaining why he left. And in every version of that dream, there was a good reason. A reason that made it okay." He finally turned around, tears streaming down his face. "But there isn't one, is there?" Brian shook his head, tears matching his son's. "No, there isn't." Joseph nodded once. Then he opened the door and walked out. But unlike Mary, he didn't close it behind him. He left it open, just a crack. And in that small gesture, that tiny, possibly unconscious decision not to shut Brian out completely, there lived the faintest possibility of something Brian didn't deserve but desperately needed. Hope. That open door Joseph left behind? That's what grace looks like when it's still deciding whether to fully arrive. Some of you are watching this and thinking about the doors you've left cracked open for people who hurt you. The fathers, husbands, children who you haven't fully forgiven, but haven't fully rejected either. That in-between space is where healing begins. Messy, uncertain, painful healing. If you know what it's like to leave a door open when everything in you wants to slam it shut, hit subscribe. You're in the right place. Because what comes next will show you why those open doors matter more than we realize. The crisis hit Hampton Dynamics at 3:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning. Brian's phone erupted with calls the chief technology officer, the head of security, board members demanding answers. A catastrophic vulnerability in Hampton's cloud infrastructure had been discovered, not by internal teams, by a hacker collective threatening to expose client data from Fortune 500 companies unless Hampton paid $50 million within 72 hours. The breach could destroy everything Brian had built. By 6 a.m., the executive team had assembled in the war room a windowless conference space designed for exactly this kind of disaster. Laptops lined the table. Coffee appeared in endless waves. Tension thickened the air until breathing felt difficult. Brian stood at the head of the table, exhausted and hollow. He'd barely slept since Joseph and Mary had confronted him. Now his company was imploding. "How bad is it?" he asked Marcus Webb, the CTO. Marcus looked grim. "Bad. The vulnerability is in our legacy authentication system, the one we built the entire platform on back in 2007. If they exploit it fully, they'll have access to 18 years of client data." Jennifer Okafor, strategy chief, leaned forward. "We need to notify clients, prepare PR statements, get legal involved immediately. Stock price will tank," someone muttered. "Better than a full breach going public," Jennifer countered. Brian pressed his fingers to his temple, Joseph's exact gesture, he realized with a pang, trying to think through the chaos. The door opened. Joseph Miller stepped inside, Mary right behind him. The room went silent. Both looked like they hadn't slept either. Joseph carried his laptop. Mary held a tablet and a stack of printouts. "Mr. Hampton," Joseph said, his voice steady despite the obvious exhaustion. "We need to talk to you. Now." Brian's heart clenched. Not now. He couldn't handle another confrontation now. "Joseph, Mary, this isn't a good time. We're dealing with—" "The data breach," Mary interrupted. "We know. That's why we're here." Marcus frowned. "How do you know about the breach? That information is—" "We found it," Joseph said flatly. 3 days ago." The room erupted. "What? You found it and didn't report it? This is a massive security violation." "Stop," Brian said quietly, but with enough authority that everyone fell silent. He looked at the twins. "Explain." Joseph set his laptop on the table, opening it to reveal pages of code. "Mary and I were working late on a strategic planning analysis. We needed historical client acquisition data, so I accessed the legacy database through the intern portal. That system isn't supposed to be accessible to interns," Marcus said sharply. "It wasn't," Joseph replied, "but the authentication token expired improperly, and instead of kicking me out, it elevated my permissions. I could see everything." Mary continued, her voice calm and professional despite the tension. Joseph realized immediately something was wrong. "We spent the last 3 days tracing the vulnerability. It's not just in the authentication system, it's in how the legacy code interfaces with the new cloud infrastructure." She handed her tablet to Marcus, who scanned it with widening eyes. "We found the exact exploit the hackers are using," Joseph said, "and we found the fix." Brian stared at them. You fixed it?" "We wrote a patch," Mary corrected. "But we needed executive authorization to implement it. That's why we're here." Marcus was scrolling through Mary's documentation, his expression shifting from skepticism to astonishment. This is actually brilliant. If this works, it will work," Joseph said with quiet confidence. "We've tested it in a sandbox environment. The patch closes the vulnerability without disrupting current operations." Jennifer looked between the twins and Brian. "Who are these interns?" Before Brian could answer, Mary pulled out another document. "We also traced the hacker collective. They're not sophisticated, they found the vulnerability by accident. If we implement the patch and notify the FBI, we can shut them down before they go public." The room exploded into motion. Marcus grabbed Joseph's laptop. The security team crowded around Mary's tablet. Questions flew. Brian stood frozen, watching his children command the room with the same authority he'd spent decades cultivating. Over the next 6 hours, Joseph and Mary worked alongside Hampton's senior engineers to implement the patch. By noon, the vulnerability was closed. By 2 p.m., the FBI had arrested 3 members of the hacker collective. By 3 p.m., news vans were parked outside Hampton Dynamics. Brian stood in the lobby, watching through the glass as reporters set up cameras. Somehow, word had leaked. Not about the breach itself, but about the interns who'd saved the company. Jennifer appeared at his elbow. "We need to give a statement. The media is demanding answers." Brian nodded slowly. "What do you want me to say?" Jennifer asked. "Nothing," Brian said. "I'll handle this." He walked outside into the chaos of flashing cameras and shouted questions. "Mr. Hampton, is it true 2 interns discovered the breach? Can you confirm Hampton Dynamics was hacked? Who are Joseph and Mary Miller?" Brian raised his hand, and the crowd quieted slightly. "Hampton Dynamics faced a significant security challenge this week," he began, his voice steady. "It was identified and resolved thanks to the extraordinary efforts of 2 members of our intern program." A reporter from Tech Daily pushed forward. "Mr. Hampton, sources say these interns not only found the breach, but wrote the fix. How does it feel, knowing 2 college students saved your billion-dollar company?" The question hung in the air. Brian looked back at the building. Through the glass doors, he could see Joseph and Mary standing in the lobby, watching, waiting. Their faces were guarded, uncertain. They'd saved his company, his legacy, the empire he'd chosen over them 19 years ago. And now they stood there, still strangers to the world, still unknown as anything more than talented interns. Brian made a decision. "Joseph and Mary Miller are not just interns," he said, his voice growing stronger. "They are brilliant. They are extraordinary. They have more integrity and courage than most people I've worked with in 20 years. Cameras flashed, reporters leaned closer, and they are my children." The world stopped. Gasps rippled through the crowd. What? Did he just say, his children? Brian didn't look away from the cameras. "I was not part of their lives for 19 years. That is my failure, not theirs. But today, and every day forward, I want the world to know. Joseph and Mary Miller are my son and daughter. And I am more proud of them than anything else I have ever accomplished." The lobby doors opened. Joseph and Mary stood frozen, faces pale, eyes wide with shock. Brian turned to face them, tears streaming down his face unashamed. "I'm sorry," he said, voice breaking. "I'm sorry. I wasn't there. I'm sorry. I chose wrong. But I'm here now. And if you'll let me, I want to spend the rest of my life proving you didn't save the wrong man's company." Mary's hand flew to her mouth. Joseph's eyes filled with tears. The cameras captured everything. And in that moment, broadcast live, documented forever, the impossible thing happened. Mary ran forward and threw her arms around Brian. Then Joseph followed. And Brian held his children for the first time in 19 years, surrounded by flashing cameras and shouting reporters, finally choosing them. Did you feel that shift? That's what redemption looks like when it's real, not perfect, not polished, but public and undeniable. Brian just claimed his children in front of the whole world. Some of you know what it's like to finally be claimed by someone who should have chosen you from the start. Some of you are still waiting for that moment. If this scene made your throat tight and your eyes burn, leave a comment telling me why. Because this community is built on women who understand that being chosen, truly chosen, can heal wounds we didn't think could ever close. Stay with us. The invitation came 3 days after the press conference. A text message. Simple, direct, very Barbara. Dinner, Saturday, 6 p.m. My house, just the 4 of us. Brian stared at those 13 words for 20 minutes before typing back a single word. Thank you. Saturday arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that made Chicago feel almost forgiving. Brian stood on Barbara's front porch at 5:58 p.m., holding a bottle of wine he'd agonized over for an hour and a bouquet of flowers that now felt absurdly inadequate. He'd faced down boardrooms full of hostile investors. He'd pitched billion-dollar deals. He'd built an empire from nothing. None of it compared to knocking on this door. The door opened before he could. Barbara stood there in jeans and a soft blue sweater, her hair pulled back, no makeup, looking exactly like the girl he'd fallen in love with 20 years ago, and nothing like her at all. "You're early," she said. "I didn't want to be late." Something flickered in her eyes, not quite forgiveness, but maybe acknowledgement. "Come in." The dining room table was set for 4. Blue ceramic plates Barbara had probably owned for years. Mismatched cloth napkins. A centerpiece of fresh sunflowers that looked like something Mary had picked up at the farmer's market. It was modest, warm, lived in. Everything Brian's penthouse apartment wasn't. Joseph sat at one end of the table, shoulders tense, jaw tight. He didn't look up when Brian entered. Mary sat across from him, offering Brian a small, tentative smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Barbara gestured to the remaining chair. "Sit," Brian did, setting the wine and flowers on the counter first, suddenly aware of how out of place they looked in this kitchen that had functioned perfectly well without his contributions for 19 years. Silence settled over the table like a weight. Barbara brought out a roast chicken, roasted vegetables, fresh bread, simple food, the kind of meal that said, family, without trying too hard. She served everyone in silence. The scrape of serving spoons against dishes was the only sound. When everyone had food in front of them, Barbara sat down. Nobody ate. "Well," Barbara said finally, her voice carefully neutral. "This is awkward." Mary let out a surprised laugh. Small, nervous, but real. Joseph's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. Brian exhaled shakily. "Barbara, Let's say grace first," Barbara interrupted. Brian blinked. He didn't remember Barbara being religious in college. But Joseph and Mary immediately reached for each other's hands. Mary extended her hand toward Brian. After a moment's hesitation, Joseph did the same toward Barbara. Barbara looked at Brian. "We hold hands." Brian's throat tightened. He took Mary's hand on one side soft, small, trembling slightly. Then he reached across the corner of the table toward Barbara. She stared at his outstretched hand for a long moment. Then, she took it. Her hand was warm, calloused, the hand of a woman who'd worked hard for everything she had. "Joseph," Barbara said quietly, "would you like to say grace?" Joseph cleared his throat. Sure. He closed his eyes. "Thank you for this food. Thank you for family, even when it's complicated. And, help us figure out what comes next. Amen." "Amen," Mary and Barbara echoed. Brian couldn't speak. He just nodded. They released hands, and slowly, carefully, they began to eat. For the first few minutes, the only sounds were forks against plates and the occasional request to pass something. Then Mary broke the silence. "The media storm has been insane," she said, glancing at Brian. "My phone hasn't stopped buzzing for 3 days." "Mine either," Joseph muttered. "I'm sorry," Brian said immediately. "I should have warned you before I—" "No." Mary shook her head. "I'm not mad about it. I mean, it was shocking. But I think I'm glad you said it. Publicly. It felt like you were choosing us, finally." Brian's vision blurred. "I was. I am." Barbara set down her fork. "Brian, you wanted to say something earlier. Say it now." All eyes turned to him. Brian took a shaky breath. "I've spent the last 3 weeks trying to figure out the right words to apologize for 19 years, he began, his voice rough. "And I've realized there aren't any. Nothing I say can make up for what I missed. Nothing I do can give you back the father you deserved." Joseph's jaw tightened. "But I need you to know," Brian continued, looking at each of them in turn, "that leaving your mother was the worst decision I've ever made. Not because of what happened to my career or my life, but because I lost you, all 3 of you, and I was too much of a coward to even realize what I'd thrown away." Barbara's eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Brian said. "I haven't earned it. I'm not asking to be called Dad or to suddenly have a place in your lives. But I'm asking for a chance. The smallest chance to prove that I'm not the same terrified kid who ran away from the best thing he ever had." His voice broke completely. "I'm asking to try." Silence. Then Mary spoke, her voice soft. "I forgive you." Brian's head snapped up. Mary's eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "I'm still hurt. I'm still angry. But I forgive you, because holding on to it feels heavier than letting it go." She reached across the table and took Brian's hand. "I want to know you," she whispered. "I want to try." Brian couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, just squeezed her hand and nodded. All eyes turned to Joseph. He sat rigid, staring at his plate, jaw working. "Joseph," Barbara said gently, "nobody's pressuring you." "I know." His voice was tight. I don't know if I can do this as easily as Mary." You don't have to, Brian said quickly. Joseph, I mean it. You don't owe me anything. Joseph finally looked up, and his eyes were filled with tears. Mom told me once that forgiveness isn't for the person who hurt you, it's for yourself, so you're not carrying around their mistake forever. He wiped his face roughly. I'm not ready to call you Dad. I might never be. But I'm willing to see what happens if we try. Something broke open in Brian's chest, relief and grief and hope all at once. That's more than I deserve, he whispered. Barbara cleared her throat. When Brian looked at her, he saw 19 years of pain and resilience and exhaustion written in the lines of her face. I spent a long time hating you, she said quietly. And then I spent an even longer time trying not to care about you at all. But watching you these last few weeks, watching you choose them publicly, watching you break down, watching you actually try. She paused, struggling. I don't forgive you easily. I can't. What you did shaped 19 years of my life in ways you'll never fully understand. But I'm willing to let you be part of theirs. If that's what they want. It is, Mary said immediately. I think so, Joseph added quietly. Barbara nodded. Then we'll figure it out. All of us, together. Brian looked around the table at the woman he'd loved and lost, at the children he'd never known, at this family he hadn't built, but desperately wanted to be part of. Thank you, he whispered. All of you. Thank you. Mary smiled, genuine this time. So, can we eat now? This chicken is getting cold. Laughter broke the tension. Small, tentative, but real. They ate. And as forks clinked and conversations started hesitant at first, then gaining momentum, something shifted. The four of them weren't strangers anymore. They weren't quite a family yet either. But they were trying. And in that modest dining room, with mismatched napkins and simple food and 19 years of absence between them, they shared something neither money nor time could buy. A beginning, the first real meal together. The first chapter of a life none of them expected, but all of them were willing to write. Together. This is where I want to leave you tonight, dear ones. At the table, with the family that almost wasn't. Because that's where healing really happens. Not in grand gestures or tearful apologies, but in the quiet decision to pass the potatoes and try again. How many of you are sitting at tables right now with people you're learning to forgive, or maybe you're the one hoping to be forgiven? Either way, you belong here. Subscribe and join this community of people who know that broken families can sit down to dinner together and call it progress. Share this story with someone who needs to know it's never too late to choose differently. And drop a comment telling me, what does forgiveness look like in your family? Because every story matters. Every choice to try again matters. And you, yes, you watching this right now, you matter. Welcome home. Sometimes the story we're meant to live isn't the one we planned. Sometimes it's the one we almost destroyed, but found the courage to rebuild. And sometimes the greatest legacy isn't what we build alone, it's who we choose to become when given a second chance. This is their story. A family fractured and reformed. Imperfect, fragile, but real. And that's where all the best stories begin.